The other day, I stumbled onto a Twitter feed of another author, a writer of books for young readers as I am, and it sent me through a cycle of emotions. First angry, then sad, then worried, and finally afraid. For myself, yes, but for art and for artists and for the power and freedom of creative expression. She was describing her choice not to write, not to try and publish a book she cared passionately about because she didn't belong to the marginalized group imagined in her story. To be honest, I don't remember what the story was, just that within moments, numerous tweets chimed in with praise for her bravery, one using the phrase, "It's time to cede the floor." Without question, marginalized groups have not had the opportunities to write and to publish their own stories in their own voices. And as a result, their stories have often been littered with dangerous and pervasive stereotypes, their lives and histories misrepresented or erased altogether. This is a huge issue, and one that we all need to work to change. So what was bothering me? I couldn't figure it out until I began to look back to my own journey to becoming an artist. I was published after 9 years of rejections by Little Brown. And at that time, I was writing stories exclusively based on my own life, and I felt like I was cheating, using myself as a main character and not having to stretch my imagination any further than my own memories. 6 years and 5 books later, I was still publishing, but secretly, I didn't believe I could call myself a writer. I told myself that it was the proverbial journey of the artist, that an artist's first work is always autobiographical, except that my second and my third and my fourth and my fifth and my sixth novels were all pretty much autobiographical. To be fair, I did have a lot of material. I was writing about my mother's suicide when I was 3.5 years old, and what it felt like growing up without a mother's love or protection. About being left a few years later with my stepmother and her boyfriend, and how he occasionally punched and kicked me, and what it felt like to live in fear. I wrote about being dumped back with my father at the start of middle school, angry, silenced, and alone, how I acted out, shoplifting, smoking cigarettes, getting suspended from school, until my 6th grade language arts teacher read one of my stories out loud in class and declared it to be the best. I'm pretty sure that it wasn't, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. So when I had exercised enough of those demons, I decided it was time to take a risk, to see if I could be a real writer, a real artist. It was 2007, and if you remember at that time, autism was all over the news, causes and cures being dissected and discussed. I related to, or rather I rebelled against the idea that what you were, or really what the world decided you were, was something to be labeled, something to be fixed. And so for my next project, I chose a 12-year-old boy diagnosed with high-functioning autism, and I named him Jason Blake. I plunged into research, fiction and nonfiction. I immersed myself in movies, internet searches, personal blogs, interviews. I searched for the right voice, the right entry point into a perspective which on the surface seems so different than mine. I'm not 12, I'm not a boy, I've never been diagnosed as being on the spectrum. But the more I wrote, the closer I got to my character, the more we became one. I wasn't trying to speak for autistic people or write a book about autism. I wasn't trying to be a doctor or a teacher or policymaker, social worker. I was writing about one boy, one fictional character, one possible human being who I had brought into existence with the hope that his single small story would speak to a larger universal truth. Accept me for who I am. That novel, Anything But Typical, won the American Library Association Schneider Family Book Award in 2010. an award given to books that embody the artistic expression of the disability experience for child and adolescent audiences. And I thought then I might be a real writer, a real artist. I had finally written in a way that wasn't me, talking about myself in my own voice. I had done what artists do, looking deeply at themselves and at the world around them, and maybe reflecting something meaningful about humanity. So jump ahead, 2013. I'm working on a new idea for a novel that will become 9/10, a September 11th story. I want to represent the ways in which 9/11 affected everyone across this entire country, as it certainly did me. So I deliberately choose 4 characters, spanning California to New York, rural to urban, black to white, boy to girl, Jewish to Muslim to Christian. I want to make them as different as I can so I can reveal how similar they actually are. I am many things other than a white Jewish middle-aged female, but what I am not is a Muslim girl from Iranian heritage with 2 physicians for parents. But during my research into Shia head covering and hand-washing practices, I had the wonderful moment of realization that some Islamic and Jewish traditions are so similar, I could enter Nahid's life as seamlessly and lovingly as I would set my own table for Passover. I am not Amy, the white Jewish girl from California with 2 married parents and a close, loving, connected relationship with her mom. I am not Will, who comes not only from a loving, functional family, but lives in a tight-knit, supportive community. Nothing I was familiar with growing up. I am also not a 12-year-old African-American boy. And yet, Sergio's emotional truth, the way he walks the earth, his anger and distrust of authority, his experience with loss and abandonment are all very real to me. At the same time, I always knew it was important to have my work vetted by those whose personal experience more closely resembled the characters I was writing about. I had Anything But Typical, read by an autistic artist in Canada. I had Ruby on the Outside, read by a whole group of children from an organization that helps incarcerated women and their children. And I had 9/10, read by an Iranian friend, Dr. Homa Sadagian, and by her husband. I did it because I cared about what I wrote, and I wanted to ensure, or at least try as hard as I possibly could, that I wasn't being tone deaf, that I wasn't inserting any mistakes. Of course, I have work to do, and a large part of that work is knowing what I don't know. But now I have to ask myself something. Would I be brave enough in this heated, angry, bifurcated social media call-out culture to have written any of those books that were not concretely about my life? Would I be afraid to create a character that was not of my culture, not my background, not my particular disability, not my religion, not my gender, not my sexual preference? And the answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that bad writing, lazy writing, should always be called out. Stories that propagate stereotypes, that have flat, one-dimensional characters. Stories that depict an inaccurate historical record should always be critiqued and reviewed as such. And this is especially important in the stories written for children, the readers we consider most vulnerable and easily influenced, regardless of who writes them. That is not to say who gets to tell a story doesn't matter, because it does. It matters because when there are more authentic voices in print, the accepted narratives will begin to shift and repair. Having more diverse authors, more diverse faces behind those voices will give young people new role models of all shapes, colors, and walks of life, because after all, that's probably the most important part of this whole discussion. As Chad Everett, a literary specialist, told me, he wants his students to see themselves, not only between the pages, but on the back cover. Publishers need to start buying more books from minority authors in order to engender this inclusivity. And if that comes at the expense of my work being published, then that's how it needs to be. But the decision of what gets published and what does not, what is bought and what sells, never belonged to the writer. That power belongs to the industry, to the publishers, to the editors, to the agents, to the sales and marketing departments, to the big chain booksellers, to the gatekeepers. Money and economic factors dictates that market, and it is going to take a united effort to combat those much larger, deeply rooted and complicated issues. But when voices on the internet become so loud and so angry and so vitriolic that artists become afraid to experiment, to make mistakes, to be creative, to push boundaries, to do what writers do, to write what they feel passionately about, then we should all be afraid. Afraid of a world where writers are considered brave for not writing, and angry at a society where artists are berated and at times punished for trying to tell a story that speaks to them from a very deep place that few of us can even define, and saddened by the message that there is a limited number of spaces at the table, and the only way for one story to be told is for another to be silenced. One of the most meaningful and powerful things I discovered when I wrote a book about a boy diagnosed with autism was completely unexpected. When I thought I had successfully created a character that wasn't me, when I thought I had finally become an artist, I took a step back and I saw how much of me is in Jason, how much of Jason is in me. We both know what it feels like to be unseen and unheard. We have both dissociated when the world around us becomes too scary. We both struggle to fit into this world, but neither of us really wants to. We are both human beings. And what I learned so profoundly writing this novel is that we are all uniformly human in many uniquely human ways. Of course, I can't fully know what it is to be diagnosed autistic, or to be African American, or to be a white teenager from Shanksville, Pennsylvania. I'm still trying to figure out what it means to be me. But what I do know, and what I can write about, is the universal desire for identity and belonging, and I need to be free to use as many paintbrushes as possible to try and create that picture, with the hope that one day I will get closer to the truth, to a truth, in one particular moment in time. Artists cannot cede the floor because they do not stand on the floor. They look at themselves and at the world in which they are living, and they speak in many voices. Writers stare out the window. They push open the door. They look up at a ceiling poked so full of holes, you cannot tell where the earth ends and where the sky begins. And when it's done well, when it's honest and true, and done without fear, what we are forced to see is ourselves. And we may see something we like, but better yet, something we don't. Thank you.